When you buy a bike in a bike shop, it will come set up for you, and the staff there would have been able to help you get things set up, like your brakes in the right position and the suspension set up with the correct sag. But increasingly these days, it's very popular to buy bikes online. When you buy a bike online or direct, it's going to come in a box, which means the bike will be pre-built and you're going to have to do some of that assembly yourself. This is how you put your bike together safely, and these are all the things you need to check. So it's no secret that I love my 29-inch wheel bikes, but Nukeproof actually want me to swap out my 29er for 27.5 for a while, so this is a new 27.5-inch wheel bike for me to try, so it's the perfect opportunity to put it out of the box and show you the best way to get it set up and a few little neat tips and tricks along the way. Now you get two different types of boxes. You get the top loading ones, and the bike's quite often in a lot of pieces with the wheels removed from it, or you get the toolboxes like this one. So it's going to have both wheels on the bike so you can wheel the whole thing out. Now you open these at either end. Take care to not cut anything on the bike, like tyres for example, if you're going to use a knife, and be careful of these big staples you see on the box because it's really easy to scratch your skin with those. So I'm just going to open the end of the box here with a knife, just very carefully, just enough to split the tape, and then I'm going to pull it out, and then we'll see what we see. So as you can see, this bike is more or less in one piece and it's ready to sort of assemble and set up. But quite often you'll pull the bike out of the box, there'll be handlebars off the bike, the saddle won't be on there, and there'll be a box of small components, and there'll be things in there like a shock pump. So make sure you don't throw that away by accident. In this particular case, the bike has got a lot of lagging to protect the frame tubes, and it's all held together with cable ties. Now, as you know, I'm a massive fan of cable ties, so when you cut these things off, you want to try and reuse them if you can. Now there's two options for this. You can either just whittle the little locking bit with a knife or a screwdriver, or you can cut them at the longest possible point, which means you get a shorter zip tie, but you still get one that's going to be able to be reused on other areas. Now, if you're not going to reuse those cable ties, you're just going to cut them off. Ideally, don't do it with a knife because it's really easy to slip and slit a tyre or scratch your brand new bike, basically. So use a quality set of cutters or a pair of scissors. And in this case, you can see that I've managed to I can still reuse that cable tie as well. So it's all about recycling, reuse as much of this stuff as possible. It's well worth keeping the lagging as well for when you're traveling with your bike. Quite often you'll find the rear derailleur won't be attached to the dropout itself. The reason for that is it can't get damaged in transit, and nor will your dropout get bent. So just before you put it on, it's well worth putting a bit of thread lock on the threads of that, because it's one of those components that can rattle loose in time. And it's also one of those things that kind of goes unnoticed. You know, it would just happen at an annoying time, no doubt. So just going to screw this into place. Then we're going to go upstairs to the workshop. So we're going to start up at the front of the bike here. We're going to get the bars into the stem. Now the first thing to note is the fact that this has got a carbon fibre handlebar. So I do recommend using some sort of carbon assembly compound to make sure it grips sufficiently in the stem and you don't need to over tighten that faceplate. Speaking of which, I definitely recommend using a torque wrench. On this particular stem, it says 5 to 6 Newton meters, so it does give you the correct torque settings there. If you don't have one, I'm just going to show you a couple of tips on how to safely tighten it without damaging those handlebars. So put the handlebar into place, hold the faceplate on, get the bar to the sort of rough angle that you like. You can tweak this later and get those bolts. Do the opposite bolts up first. And don't over tighten them straight away, you just want to pinch them up. And note, look at the faceplate, make sure the distances are equal on all 4 points. It's the closest you're going to get to a torque wrench setting effectively. Now, because I do have a torque wrench here, I am just going to confirm that this is correctly tightened. I'll set it at 5.5 because that sits perfectly between the 5 and 6. And I'm just going to go and check these bolts. Perfect. I would recommend using a torque wrench around the bike if you have one, especially on anywhere like this where it's a clamping style bolt. So in particular, look at the seat tube and the seat clamp on there, especially if it's a carbon frame. Now this particular bike out of the box has actually got some cable ties holding the cables together, so it's nice and neat here. But if yours doesn't, you definitely want to consider doing this because it neatens everything up. You don't get the flappy cables that bash around. So you can either do that with cable ties or with some black electrical tape. It works really well. And like I said, it quietens it down as well. Now a little hack I like to do on all of my bikes is get a joining master link for my chain and tape it directly onto the cables with a bit of electrical tape. So it's easy to access, you don't need any tools to get it off, and it means you can rejoin a chain if you're unlucky enough to break one on the trail. it's always on the bike. Perfect little hack. Now, when you get your bike out of the box, some bikes will be supplied with their tyres inflated, some will be soft, some will be tubeless, and some will have inner tubes in. So it's entirely up to your preference how you do this. Now, I can't stand inner tubes. I only ever carry them as a spare part. So I'm going to take this opportunity to set mine up tubeless from the beginning. We're sponsored by Continental here at GMBN, so I'm going to put my preference of tyres on straight away and put these ones aside. So got the tyres inflated, set up tubeless, so it's pretty much ready to hit the trails when I want to ride. Now, tyre pressure is a personal preference thing. You want to be somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 pounds to start with, and then sort of find what works for you in your conditions locally. Now, just while I'm here at the front wheel, I'm going to check the front brake calipers not rubbing, and I just want to make sure it's tight. I really want to emphasise the point that you should make sure that all the bolts are tight. Now, they will have been done at the factory, they will have been done by mechanics, but you should still check them yourself. So when doing the wheels, I've obviously checked that the front and rear axles are nice and securely tight. I've now done the brakes as well, so I know they're safe. I know the stem is nice and tight and that's safe. I'm just going to work my way around all the pivot bolts just to double check everything is tight, and do the same with the chain device. Any extra bolts on a bike, you should just do the same. Now, in the little box of bits that comes with your bike, you'll probably find some of these little pedal washers. Occasionally, they do come cable tied to the cranks themselves. It's well worth putting these on, and make sure you put a tiny bit of grease just on your pedal thread there. Not too much, it's just enough to make sure that the pedals go on smoothly and they don't sort of bind up on there. Now, the rule with pedals is they always tighten to the front of the bike and loosen to the rear. That's the same for the right and the left pedal. Now, I'll tighten these properly with the bike on the floor, because you can actually use your body weight just to make sure it's sufficiently tight. I'm just going to run the other one on there as well. So because your bike has been pre-assembled and will have been pre-checked, your gears should be fully indexed and aligned correctly. But you definitely want to make sure that they do work correctly, because it's a bit of a pain when you get out on the trail and your gears aren't working. First thing to do is check your gear outer. In this case, it's partially external, partially internal routing. I just want to make sure there's no sort of kinks in the cable where it's been crimped or squashed. And you want to make sure it sits into the stops completely. So in that way, the cable tension will actually have the proper effect of changing the gears. Next up is you want to check the alignment of the rear derailleur. So what you want is to make sure that the upper guide wheel is completely in line with the smallest sprocket when it's in the highest gear, and obviously the same when it's underneath the biggest sprocket. Make sure that's nice and aligned. You might need to do some adjustment with those high and low limit screws. That's all they're for, is to set those. Once they're done, you don't need to do it again. If your bike's travelled a long way, like for example, if you bought a bike from Canyon, it would have been shipped from Germany. So just make sure that there isn't any damage to the rear derailleur or the hanger itself, because if that's bent from the start, then the gears will never be perfect, and it's something that does need to be addressed. Now, it's a very rare occurrence for that to happen with a bike that ships like this, but it can happen. So this is why you should be checking all this stuff before you hit the trails. Something I always like to do with the bike build straight out of the box is spray a bit of multi-purpose lube just on the pivot just behind the mech here, because that's one of those places you don't often pay much attention to, and that's where little squeaks and creaks can develop when it dries out. As always, when spraying lube on your bike, make sure it goes nowhere near your braking surfaces. That is absolutely crucial if you want your brakes to be able to work and stop you safely. So whilst we're down the back of the bike, I want to talk to you a little bit about protection. This particular bike's got a really sturdy rubber chainstay protector here. Obviously protects it from chipping from the paint, and more importantly from my point of view, deadens down that noise. You don't want annoying chain slap. Now, it's also well worth putting some on the underside of the chainstay, which on this particular bike there isn't any, because despite how good the clutch mechs are these days, the chain can still rattle your paint away there and make noise. And the other place is on the inside of the seat stay here. Now, when your chain is slack in those higher gears, it can fly up and rattle on the inside here. So if you want your bike to be really silent as well as protecting it from paint chips, this is what you do. Now, there's various different rubber tapes on the market. I'm using a Scotch mastic tape here. I've been a fan of this stuff for years because it's so sticky and it stays in place wherever you put it. Now, the next stage really is to get the fine tuning done. So we're going to get the suspension set up, that's your air pressure, front and rear, and get the cockpit dialed in so everything is in the right position for you. Before we do that though, I'm going to put some volume spacers in my shock because I actually know how I like this shock to feel, having ridden the 29-inch one first. So I'm going to remove that air can. Now, I just want to show you a little cool tool for doing this, because you can do this while it's on the bike and it actually makes it a bit easier to do it. Now, what you want to get yourself is a strap wrench. That's one of these things. You can get various sized different ones. And it's simply a rubber strap that locks itself, and you can use that to undo the air can. Of course, you can't do it by hand, but sometimes it can be hard to get good purchase on it, and this will not damage your shock either. Pretty cheap, you can get it from most hardware stores, and well worth having if you like to tinker with your bikes. There we go. So just on this particular shock, you need to slide the shaft down and pop on 3 spacers that I like to run on this system. The spacers simply slide onto the shaft and you pop them into place here. There we go, and you find they kind of push in nicely at the top there. Push that washer back over it and the O-ring will hold it in place. And you're good to screw the can back on. And I also know that I like to have 3 volume spacers in the Lyric fork as well, so I'm just going to remove the top cap. Now it's important to use the correct tool for this. On the new style RockShox, it's actually a cassette tool that goes in there, so it's really good because it doesn't slip. But on other ones, you need a decent spanner with a sharp edge. I definitely wouldn't recommend using a conventional adjustable spanner on those top caps because they're alloy, they're quite soft, they're very easy to damage. So I would use a decent, well-fitting socket on that. So there was 1 volume spacer as standard in here. As I said to you, I like 3 in my Lyric forks, just to make sure that they're nice and tight on there, and then get that top cap back in place. So when setting your rear shock sag, there's a few things that you need to take into account. So the first one is if your shock has any kind of lockout, make sure it's not activated, i.e. make sure the shock is fully open and can move and it's not hindered by that. The second one is most rear shock manufacturers will have a table with recommended weight to air pressure ratio, so that's a really good starting point. And they will also have base recommendations on the rebound and compression settings for your particular shock. They give you a good starting point, and then once from there you can work it out yourself to see what you like. One thing to note though, the same with the front suspension, is when you get a setting you like, definitely note it down somewhere. So whatever other adjustments you make, you can always easily return it to the same point. It's the same if you lend your bike to a friend and they need to either inflate or deflate the shocks to get them set up for them. You'll know exactly how to get back to it as fast as possible, which means more time on the trail, so it's better for everyone. When you first inflate a shock like this particular one, you need to inflate about 100 psi into it, remove the shock pump, and then cycle the rear end of the bike. And the reason for that is it will swap air via the transfer port from the positive into the negative chamber. If you end up with a shock that's just positively charged, it will have a bit of top out and it won't ever feel, it'll feel quite linear and it won't ever feel quite right. So make sure you do that before you go any further towards setting your sag. Now I'm just going to sit on the bike and demonstrate to you how soft it is initially before I start putting some air into it. As you can see, the O-ring is way past. That's using about 2/3 of the available travel on this particular shock. I'm looking to be somewhere between these first 3 markers here, between the 20% and 30%. So it's going to need quite a bit more air for that. So I'm just going to connect my shock pump and start inflating. So you can see here it's running at 40%, so it's not too far off, but again, I reckon another 20, maybe 30 PSI will get me in the right region there. So I've now got about 230 PSI in this rear shock, and that looks about right to me. So I'm actually going to add in another £10 just to compensate for my riding pack and all that sort of stuff, and then that's good to go. I've just got a middle of the road setting with the rebound on there, and the compression is off for the time being. Then it's time to move on to the front fork once you've done that. Now the fork is a little bit different because you've got those guidelines already printed on the fork, so you're going to be able to get to a good base setting a lot faster than a shock, which quite often requires a bit of to and fro like I've just shown you. So the chart on the back of the fork leg there has told me for my rider weight, I'm looking at about 70 PSI to 80 PSI. So I'm just going to put 75 in for the time being and then figure it out from there. So there we go. So I've got about 75 in there. Now, unlike setting up the rear shock, you kind of need to have more bias of your weight to the front. So initially, I'm going to rest my weight on one pedal and sit on the front of the bike here and just see what sort of indication I get. So that's hovering on about 30%, which is actually about where I want it. A little soft, so I'm just going to add in a little bit more pressure. There we go, we're hovering just under 30 PSI there using those markers on the fork leg. That looks good to me, I'm happy with that. Next up is to get your controls in the right position. That means the angle of your brake levers, how inboard you like them to feel, and a position of the shifter there, which are all sort of personal preference things. Now, I like my brake levers quite flat, and I like my shifter to be quite far towards me. A lot of people like it further away, but I don't like to have to reach for it. I like it to be as close as possible, so I have to move my thumb the minimal amount. So I tend to have that as far this way as I possibly can. Now you might remember from a video I did recently, I used a cool little app on my phone that had a digital protractor. I like my brake levers around 30 degrees, so it's pretty easy for me to do this without too much effort. So I'm just going to get my levers set exactly where I like them first time. Now it does vary depending on the handlebars you're clamping to and which particular manufacturer you're using, but typically your brake lever clamp should be tightened between around 6 and 8 Newton meters onto the bars. Now the important thing is you don't want to over tighten them on a carbon bar and damage the bar, but personally I don't like to over tighten my brake levers so they don't move. I actually don't mind them to move a small amount. Now they won't move in normal use, but if I do crash or hit a tree or something, they can move out of the way and not break. In the past, I have snapped brake levers in crashes that have been tightened correctly to the bars. So that is a personal preference thing, not a recommendation. So you need to figure this out for yourself. But the important thing is that your brake levers are tight on the bars and they don't move when you're using them. It is a safety item at the end of the day. So there is your rough setup of getting your bike out of the box and getting everything securely tightened and safety checked. Again, it's a bit of common sense. Work your way around the bike and make sure everything is tight and secure, especially when it comes to safety aspects like your brakes, your handlebars, the wheel axles, anything that could fall off or endanger you. Make sure that they are definitely safe because it is up to you at this point to do that. I've just got to fit a few more parts to my bike to get it the way I like it, and then I'll be getting ready to hit the trails. So there we go, we've got the bike out of the box, we've built it, we've checked it, it's safe and it's ready to hit the trails. Of course, I ran you through a bit of frame protection based stuff, but there's a lot more you can do. Another little tip from my point of view is just watch out for where cables rub on the frame. You can cover that up with heli tape, which is like a clear plastic tape, or these little rubber spiral things from a company called Fibrex that are really quite cool, and they just go over the cable, and the cable not only stops it rubbing on the frame, but it sort of dampens out the noise. So when it rattles, you don't get that knocking noise you do with cables. Of course, I like to do a few more personal things on here. You know, I've put my Crank Brothers post on here with the little grip tape bit on the bars, and of course my little trusty GMBN top cap. So hopefully this video has been helpful for you, especially all you guys that are going to go out there and buy direct sale bikes. And if you want to watch a couple more helpful videos for additional stuff like this, click down here for how to apply frame protection. And that's not just chain stays, we're talking about full frame protection kits like I fitted on Neil's bike. That's the one down there, and click up there if you want to see a video a bit more about suspension setup and the difference of volume spacers make. So a bit more of a helpful video so you can visibly see what they do out on the trail. As always, click on that round globe to subscribe to the channel, share it around, tell all your mates about us. And of course, if you found this video helpful, give us a thumbs up.